For over a year, workers have been suffering from this cost of living crisis. Unite, the union, did research which suggests that the average worker has lost €76 a week in real terms. The average family is now paying more than €1,000 extra a year on fuel, more than €1,000 extra a year on electricity, and more than €1,000 extra a year on groceries. They'll be asking the question, where is all this money going? And the answer is contained in the balance sheets of the big corporations. We know that in the US, corporations have the highest ever after-tax profit margins. We have new analysis from 3 ECB economists which reveals that 2/3 of the domestic price increases that people have experienced in the EU are accounted for by increased corporate profits. A recent Oxfam report found that 60 to 80% of the price increases in Europe and the US were down to profiteering. In other words, what we're experiencing, what we have been experiencing, is a profit-price spiral. It's not inflation that we're seeing, it's greedflation. Greed by these major corporations, and nowhere is this clearer than in the case of grocery prices. We've had 2 litres of milk go up over the course of a year by 45 cents, a pound of butter up by 68 cents, sliced pan up by 25 cents. The result, in real terms, is a doubling of the number of families who are now relying on food banks in this country in 2023 to survive. And at the very same time as that scandal takes place, and linked to it, the supermarkets and the big agri-food companies are recording record profits. Musgraves, which owns SuperValu and Centra, made more than €110 million in profits last year, an increase of 12%. Tesco, €2.6 billion profit across the UK and Ireland, with a 6.6% increase in revenue in Ireland. Glanbia, €257 million in profits last year, an increase of 53%. Larry Goodman's Slaney Food and Irish Country Meats profits increased by 27% in 2022. And what is the government's response? Well, Minister Richmond is going to meet with the grocery companies. He's going to ask them very frankly, very firmly, very clearly to reduce their prices. He's going to tell them that they have to step up to the plate. And what if they don't, Taoiseach? That's the question that has been asked twice already today. What if they continue to do what they've been doing, which is maximising their profits, operating as capitalist firms in a capitalist economy to maximise their profits? Nothing. I mean, the Taoiseach just ruled out the one stick that the government has, which is the power to introduce price controls. It's there, in black and white, in the Consumer Protection Act 2007, Section 61. The government could tomorrow, literally by the stroke of 2 pens, say we're going to have price caps on essential goods. And that's been hinted in the slightest way by Minister Richmond as a kind of a background threat to say, really, you have to reduce your prices. But now the Taoiseach says the government won't even countenance that because it will interfere with the market. So if in 6 weeks' time, as Minister says, that prices have to reduce, if they haven't been reduced then, what are you going to do about it? You're going to go back and ask nicely again, we need price controls.
When you misquote somebody and misrepresent them and put words into their mouth, it just demonstrates the weakness of your own argument. That's all it does, Deputy. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Inflation, cost of living, everyone accepts that this is a reality at the moment in our society and that people and families, many of them are struggling to make ends meet as a result of it. There are a lot of factors behind the international cost of living and inflation crisis. There's war in Europe. Of course that's been part of the cause of this. There's been the increase in interest rates. There's been a snapback in demand post-pandemic. And yes, there is profiteering by some companies, and that is absolutely part of this. And bodies like the ECB, for example, has pointed to this. But it is one factor, not the sole factor. And in fairness to you, in your contributions, you acknowledge that it was a factor, not the sole factor, depending on the good or service, Deputy. What can the government do about it? First of all, we tax profits. I've nothing against companies making profits. But they shouldn't be making margins that are out of line with those in other jurisdictions. I've said that previously. And we tax the profits of companies, and will continue to do so. And we have a powerful competition and consumer regulator. Powers were beefed up last year. Additional resources have been provided, and that body has the authority to examine prices and to carry out investigations where there is price fixing or price signalling or cartel-like behaviour, and we are engaging with the CCPC precisely on all of that. And just in reply to your contention, Deputy, I didn't rule out price controls. I outlined, in response to a question from Deputy MacDonald, what the preliminary advice from the CCPC was on that, and that indicates the unintended consequences. Prices that are not controlled going up even more, a very serious impact on small retailers, particularly in rural areas, small shops that require higher margins to survive. That's why it was abandoned in Spain. A lack of evidence from France and Greece that it has actually been beneficial for consumers, the risk of shortages, the risk of products being less available. All of that is set out in the advice, which you're welcome to read. Any action like that, Deputy, and I know you're ideologically committed to the idea that government should control prices, but you have to acknowledge that there can be consequences. We know from socialist governments in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in the Soviet Union, the consequences of price controls there. Shortages, rationing, black market, not good things.
Murphy.
Not ruling out price controls. I'm not sure what is, Taoiseach, while the meeting is just about to take place. I know what happens in a capitalist economy, Taoiseach, because I live in one. And I experience the reality of the people who come to see me and who are now dependent on food banks. Something like 1 in 7 families in this state are now dependent on food banks. Why? It's a variety of factors, yes, that's true, but the increase in prices of the basic groceries that they need to survive is a crucial factor in that. And profiteering isn't just one of a myriad of factors that lies behind that. It is the #1 factor. It's the dominant factor. The ECB research suggests that 2/3 of the price increases that we're seeing is a consequence of the profiteering. And that, again, is there in black and white in the profits of the various corporations in the grocery sector, in the big agri-food sector in this country. So to come back to the basic point, what's going to happen if they don't reduce their prices? Government says, ministers quoted as saying 6 weeks they have to reduce their prices. What's the stick?
All right.
Surely you have to say, if you're not going to rule out price controls, well then will you rule them in and say if they don't reduce the prices within 6 weeks, you use the power at your disposal to introduce price controls to bring prices down on essential goods.
Deputy, we'll only take an action like that if we're confident and we're convinced that it actually will benefit consumers. And we have to bear in mind that there's ideology and there's reality. And from an ideological point of view, and I appreciate you come from a radical socialist left-wing ideology, price controls are always a good thing. We know from real experience that price controls can have negative consequences as well, most evident in socialist, state-run, planned economies like the Soviet Union, like Eastern Europe, where it led to shortages, scarcity, rationing, and ultimately a black market. We have to bear in mind experience from other jurisdictions and also potential unintended consequences. But as I say, we tax the profits of these companies. We have powers under the CCPC to carry out investigations into price fixing, into price signalling, into cartel-like behaviour, and anyone who's evidence of that, I'd encourage them to come forward with it. And also,
Deputy, please.
And also, Deputy, there are other actions we can take as well. But the meeting is happening today. Mr. Richmond is going to be very clear in his message to retailers. When your input costs went up, you put up prices. If your input costs are coming down now, we expect to see prices come down.